I'm going to be talking a lot today, apparently, so I apologize. Actually, my dad told me never to apologize at the start of the talk, so I take back the apology. This talk is really unusual for me. It's more of a kind of to spur discussion and thought among people in the room. It's an idea that I've been kicking around for a couple years. Ever since a colleague of mine told me in 2013 that Redwood had been listed as endangered. It's been listed by a group called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on a listing called the Red List. This is not the Endangered Species Act. It has no legal or political implications, so I just want to get that out of the way. But it does have potential economic implications, and it certainly has implications about how we think about conservation. It can and how we used to think about conservation. So the objectives here are really just to tell some folks who are experts in the Redwood region, who are managers, about the status so that you understand what it is. If somebody says to you, hey, Redwood is endangered, you know why they're saying that, but also to point out what I think are really kind of fundamental flaws in this listing. In particular, its focus on single species listing, and, well, flaws kind of on the face according to the criteria of the Red List. So these are the listings you can have. There's extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, not threatened, or near threatened, and least concern. Redwood was actually upgraded from vulnerable in 2006 to endangered, as I said, in 2013. So if you go to the Wikipedia page for Sequoia sempervirens, it kind of unproblematically says that Redwood is endangered. And it's right here. So, you know, this is something where I think that people who work in the Redwood region, who are experts in the Redwood region, should know about it. I'm going to explain how this happened by giving you an overview of the Red List. I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of Redwood conservation and kind of how it's shifted, and it was really nice of Peter to kind of give some of that shift and like current focus of the State of the Redwoods League. I'll tell you some rationale provided for the listing, implications, and then finally, what does this mean for the Red List? Like, what can they learn from this listing of Redwood? So the Red List was created by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 1964. So this predates our Endangered Species Act. It predates, you know, kind of having these comprehensive lists of endangered species. And back then it was called the Red Data Books, and these have really been upgraded over time with a policy objective. So they're intended to be what's called a clarion call to action. They're intended to prioritize species and regions that are in need of conservation attention, and the list is meant to be consistent and objective so that you can compare across species, across regions, and conduct large-scale assessments of biodiversity and conservation, and they're cited by academics quite a lot. So the Red List is highly regarded. If we now kind of shift over to Redwood conservation, you know, Redwood was an interesting species to list because it has this incredibly long and storied history of conservation, and it's kind of been like this charismatic megaflora, right? It's had a lot of attention over the years, and back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it really was a sort of single species attention, even single tree attention, where it started with scenic protection for these very isolated groves. In 1918, of course, the State of the Redwoods League was established, and they started creating larger and larger protected groves. And we shifted with conservation in the late 20th century to preserving the last remnants of old growth on private lands. A lot of this was through boycotts and tree sits and legal action. And then finally, we've kind of protected all the old growth, and so there's become this shift towards maintaining and then restoring old growth function and creating it within second and third growth stands, and working across not just what are considered protected lands or reserved lands, but working with working landscapes as well. And I think that shift is a good context for thinking about the flaws of listing redwood as an endangered species. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background to the IUCN Red List. This list, it's compiled by these subcommittees of experts, and so the conifer specialist group was convened. They considered 600 species of conifers, and of those, 34% they decided were somehow threatened. So the threatened is when the species has been assessed against the criteria and is thought to be facing a high to extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. So redwood was placed as very high risk of extinction on this list. And if you were to look at kind of where they've placed these are all the species on the red list, you'll see that most are in least concern, but there are a good chunk in critically endangered, and vulnerable, and this is probably because they're assessing species that they think have a conservation risk. All right, so we're going to look a little bit at why redwood was listed. The criteria are A to ACD, and I'm not going to get into all their criteria, but the criteria A is that the population of mature individuals has been reduced, and maturity is defined as capable of reproduction. So subcriteria 2 is that the population has declined by greater than or equal to 50% over the last 10 years or 3 generations. And a generation is defined as the average age of the parents of the current cohort. So actually this could be going back for redwood quite a ways. So this is one of the problems with the listing, is that it's not very well geared to really long-lived species. And then you look at the subcriteria. This is the basis. So the species was listed as a result of direct observation. It has had a decline in area of occupancy, and the species was listed because of actual or potential levels of exploitation. And part of this is that the exploitation is not well understood or that it is continuing. And so I'm just going to share a couple quotes to kind of flesh this out. So I read through all the materials that were available to me and looked at their citations and actually contacted also the authors of the study, and I wasn't able to get much more than what I'm going to present to you. So this is basically why they listed it. It says, its late successional to climax dominance coupled with shade intolerance means it's easily replaced by more light-demanding conifers. This can be made permanent if forests are chosen to be so managed, as indeed they tend to be in commercial forestry operations. So this is kind of the crux of the listing, is the claim that redwood are being actively converted to non-redwood species. I think that I'm not going to speak to whether this is true or not. I think that there are problems in this assumption, and they actually didn't substantiate it with any citations. So another reason was that a second cause for the decline of area of occupancy is urbanization, which they say at present is a relatively minor factor. So they're not really looking at like these giant urban areas that have San Francisco built in the Redwood region, but they say it's predicted to increase much in the next few decades. This is a priority landscape, so risk of development map made by California Department of Forestry. And if you look at this, most of the Redwood region is actually low priority for development for the next 10 to 30 years. So area of occupancy is kind of defined as this like boundary around where individuals of the species can be. So again, I don't actually think that they've demonstrated that that's declining. And then the last point about the IUCN listing that I'll tell you is that they give ways to address this, and they say it's imperative to place all remaining old-growth forest in which the species is a component under strict protection. The greater portion of these forests is already so protected. And then they end with logging the species should be under stricter regulation, allowing regeneration to maturity. And again, maturity is capable of reproduction. So by their own standards, I think that they're not actually demonstrating that the species is endangered, because maturity, I mean, even at the shortest rotation ages of like 50 years old, they're kind of missing the point of the conservation needs of redwood, I think, and applying criteria that don't really match. And probably you guys are familiar with the forest practice rules of California. They're pretty strict, pretty well regulated. And especially if you think about this IUCN group looking globally, I mean, California, compared to most other jurisdictions, is really strict. So I wanted to point out a couple implications and just emphasize that there's no legal or political consequence of this. The definitions for endangered under the Federal and California Endangered Species Act emphasize risk of extinction, as does the IUCN, but certainly Redwood does not meet the Federal or California endangered criteria. But there are possible economic consequences. A lot of landowners in this region really rely on the image of redwood as a green product. So this is Big Creek Lumber, you know, right on its homepage saying it's sustainably grown. Most of the industrial companies of the region have Forest Stewardship Council certification. And I think that a lot of this message can be undermined by the listing, especially because it's kind of unproblematically presented as, look, this species is endangered. And certainly if a species is endangered, you know, our most common response is to ban its exploitation. And that's our most common tool. And I think that that's really misleading in this listing. So I'll just point out a couple flaws. I don't know that the IUCN Red List criteria are helpful for assessing a species like redwood, where threats to the species aren't existential, but threats to ecosystem function and processes. And that's kind of what we've turned our attention to. And conservation actions that are suggested by the listing are already in place and wouldn't actually address the threats identified by the practitioners in the region. And if you look at the threats, say the Redwoods League has identified a lot of different threats, but these are things like climate change, human land uses that aren't compatible with forest health, people's increasing detachment from nature. I mean, these are different threats from the continued existence of a single species. And one threat I wanted to highlight was that they don't talk a lot about, but which I think is significant, is parcelization. Ecologists tend to talk a lot about fragmentation, you know, as you create kind of these edges of habitat. Parcelization in the Redwood region is really significant as you have large-scale land ownerships that continually diminish in size. We see a lot of this happening. Realtors refer to higher and better use values of the land, right? And in this area, a lot of the higher and better use here is marijuana cultivation. It's driving real estate prices up. It's putting more people out in the landscape, more roads, more disturbance, more non-native species, but it's not necessarily diminishing the number of individual trees. It's a different kind of threat. So just a couple things for the IUCN. They weren't really interested in hearing my concerns about the listing. So I thought I'd just bring it to you guys and say this is listed as endangered. I think it's a problematic listing. But I think that the IUCN actually can learn from this. One is that they need to consult local experts. This listing came as a surprise to most people that I know of who are scientists or landowners in the area. And so IUCN kind of missed the boat because, for one thing, they were looking globally and they were not at all looking locally at a species that has had conservation focus for over 100 years. Other people have criticized the Red List in the past, particularly for being opaque, but also for mislabeling species. And one suggestion that has been around since 2003 is that there could be multiple lists created. So you could have a list about extinction. You could also have a listing assessing whether the species is fulfilling its ecological role. And another possible listing would be whether the species is maintaining economic utility. I think certainly under criteria 1 and 3, redwood is fine, but there are serious conservation concerns about ecological processes. And this is another species that kind of demonstrates the utility of multiple lists. And most of this was a literature review, so I just wanted to provide you with some citations and give you, I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Yeah.
It seems that redwoods are today 5% of what they used to be. So when you think of endangered, usually you have some mechanism for increasing, not just maintaining their area. So I wonder how you think about that.
So certainly in terms of what's it called now? Large complex forests. It's a small part of what used to exist, or old growth forests, right? But I think that the problem with this listing is actually that they're saying that the number of individuals has declined. And actually, I think that if you look at an old-growth forest and there are very few very large trees, by their criteria, the fact that you cut those down and then have a second-growth forest that's kind of more homogeneous, more densely packed, more individuals, actually there's probably been an increase in individuals. And so this endangered listing misses the point that that's not the problem, the number of individuals. The problem is the loss of function and old growth. And especially, I think that the policy prescription for endangered species, which is, a lot of the species that are listed by the red list, like pandas or, let's say, elephants. There's not a big market in pandas, but like elephants, they then go onto a banned list for exploitation. And that kind of is a knee-jerk reaction. Like, you don't exploit species that are endangered. But I think that for redwood, actually the conservation measures needed are things like producing more heterogeneity and second growth stands. It's actually active management and actively conducting management within those stands, and also connecting working forests and protected forests. So creating this contiguous habitat, contiguous structure across larger areas. And I just don't think that that's reflected in this listing. I think that they kind of missed an opportunity, mislabeled it, and now you go, it might not have any consequences, but I don't think that they're getting at that conservation need that you're bringing up, which is that there's been a decline in old growth. Of the old growth. Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's the point of the Save the Redwoods League, is how do you increase it, right? How do you actively manage to make more of these second growth forests function like large complex forests? Yeah.
Do you think that the international markets be more respectful of the IUCN listing, or maybe more cautious about purchasing redwood out of the
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that that's, I guess that is a possibility. I don't think that that's been demonstrated, but other species certainly have. So the mechanism that is kind of linked to IUN is the CITES list, right, which bans international trade in threatened and endangered species. Redwood is not proposed for that list, but I think that that's kind of, as I said, that's sort of our reaction to hearing that a species is endangered. I don't think that that's happened so far, and I think that most people would look at this and say it is a flawed listing. But yeah, I think that's potentially the implication. I also just wanted the IUCN that they maintain a very comprehensive, useful list, and I thought this was kind of a smudge on their reputation. Like, why are you listing a species that, by your own criteria, really doesn't meet your listing standard? So I wanted to bring it up to them, but like I said, they weren't receptive. So. Yeah, Jim.
They are not without their influence, because I have been in other parts of the United States and the world and have been questioned extensively about the extinction of the redwood, to the point of seeing, we don't sell redwood in the store, that sort of thing. The same thing happened with bald cypress. I was talking to a guy in Louisiana, and I said, here was a bald cypress growing on the side of the bank, and it was that big, it was 20 years old, and I said, you guys have done plantation forestry like it's mad. Why don't you put some of this bald cypress in plantations? He said it wouldn't do any good. We can't sell it because it's an endangered species, and
right.
Nobody will touch it.
Yeah, I think that's the fear, is that it would be sort of labeled as endangered in a more broad sense. So, yeah, that's a good observation. I have only seen it, I actually looked for people referencing it as endangered, and I was only able to find a couple places where it was actually referenced as existentially endangered because of this listing. So, anyway, thank you.